Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. So if you and or your team are still taking phone calls and receiving vendor supporting documentation via email, you need to authenticate that you are talking or communicating with your vendor. Please visit deborah.richardson.com/authentication, where you will find a workshop on how to build an authentication reference. This is the answer to the question, are you communicating with your vendor or with a fraudster? Learn more today at deborah.richardson.com/authentication. Since this is a short holiday week for those in the United States, Thanksgiving is being celebrated on Thursday, November 26th, which is normally the published date of this weekly podcast. So I thought I'd give you something you can listen to quickly a day before, a quick vendor master file tip on bank validations. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 111, quick episode on bank validations. So there is a video version of this on my YouTube channel that contains playlists, including the vendor master file tip of the week, on-demand webinars, which you don't have to register to view, and that has timestamps so you can kind of jump around and listen to exactly what you need. You can also find all podcast episodes, so if you're already on YouTube, you can listen to the podcast there as well. I will put a link to my channel in the show notes, and please subscribe and share with your colleagues. And now, here is that vendor master file tip of the week, bank validations, from my YouTube channel. Hi, this is Deborah R. Richardson of Deborah R. Richardson LLC, and I work with you so that you can clean up your vendor data, clean up your vendor processes so that you can pay the right vendor. And this week's vendor master file tip of the week is vendor banking validations. And there are two reasons why you want to validate your vendor banking. The first one is because you want the payment to be successful. So in the case of the ABA routing number, you want to validate that to make sure that it is valid, because sometimes banks do merge, get acquired, and the vendors do not always know this. So you want to make sure you validate that those are valid routing numbers before you enter them in your vendor master file. You also want to check at the same time whether or not that routing number is good for wires or ACHs or both, because some banks have different routing numbers for wires versus their ACHs. Now, for international banking, to make sure the payments are successful, you want to make sure that you validate the SWIFT code and the BIC code, or in case of those countries where an IBAN is required, you want to make sure that the IBAN format is correct. Now, the second reason you want to validate your vendor's banking is because you want to make sure that your vendor owns that bank account, that is your valid vendor's bank account and not a fraudster. And so there are quite a few different resources that are available for that. Some of you may have in your accounting system a pre-note process. Just be aware that not all pre-notes, not all banks with that process will return the bank account owner's name, and you want to always again make sure that bank account owner's name matches your vendor's legal name, and not all banks with the pre-notes will bring that information back. There are also services out there that will validate the bank account owner name matches the vendor legal name, and will give you certain codes once that comparison or that lookup is done. And if you want more information on both of those, I will put a link to a blog post where I review both free and paid resources to validate your vendor's banking. Thank you, and come back next week for another Vendor Master File Tip of the Week. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 111th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.